Hello, good morning, everyone. Jumelan. Okay. Minjani. Vavwani. Okay. I just wanted to test whether all the constituencies of the northern part of the country are here. But thank you very much for making the time to come and attend this seminar. We deliberately made this seminar to be on Friday because it's only people who are serious about the seminar who will come on Friday. So we thank you for really making up to this seminar. I'm not going to waste much time. So just to give you a short background of this seminar, the University of Pretoria and the University of Oslo have got a program on the Sustainable Development Goals. We're looking at the politics part of it. And it is led by these two universities with partners. What we have today is the first lecture seminar in a series of conversations that we're going to have on politics and sustainability issues. We're delighted that we have our speaker, Professor Dan Banik, who is a professor at the University of Oslo in political science. We've also appointed him here at UP as extraordinary professor in EMS, the faculty. I'm not familiar perhaps to many of you here, but my name is Mano Ramutsindera. I hold the Future Africa Research Chair, which is a joint chair between the University of Cape Town and University of Pretoria. Okay. I've got to mention these two universities everywhere I go in order to secure my salary. Okay. So coming back to Professor Banik, he has done extensive work, given extensive lectures on the topics of today. He's also involved in the Global Goals project, which is one of the, I'll call it the biggest project in Europe on this topic. And he was one of the members of the steering committee for the conference that was held more recently at the University of Utrecht. So it's a familiar terrain for him, and we're really happy that he could make the time. I know it's quite busy, but he ensured that he could come speak to us. The format of this seminar would be that Professor Banik will give a talk, we can call it a lecture, for about 45 minutes. And you should hold all the questions you have, and thereafter we would be able to have question and answers. And we hope that this will be a lively discussions for you to engage. We also having this as a hybrid meeting, so there are people who are not here physically, but they are virtually with us, so they will also be able to participate. And this seminar is also being recorded. The cameras are ready to take pictures and so forth. But we hope that after the seminar, we would also just perhaps have a picture. Just in case one of you become the president next time of a country, I'll say, I've met this person and here's the evidence. Okay. So I'm going to invite Professor Banik to give us the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Mano. Good morning. I'm so happy to be back at Future Africa, but thanks also for the nice and chilly welcome. It feels very much at home. This is the kind of weather I left Oslo 2 days ago. And I feel, it's just nice to be here. Thank you for coming on a Friday. It's my fault that I suggested this date, but apparently you are all very seriously interested in the topic. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. It's nice to see a full house, and good to know that there are people watching this event online. Let's just get started. I want to just refresh your memories of what happened around 9 years ago in 2015. What we experienced then was actually something wonderful, very optimistic, one of hope. We had the adoption, or at least member states, 193 member states in the UN adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. And if you remember, and I'm not going to show you all those details before, but it was this optimistic take on global development. This is 2015. We were not just talking about poverty reduction, we were also talking about climate change and environment. We were talking about economic growth and infrastructure. So there was this wonderful, colorful map. We'll just wait perhaps for the coffee machine to stop. I don't want to compete with the coffee machine. I'm used to just you guys looking at me. So 2015, we had this optimistic take on global development. But what happened since then? Let's just finish your coffee. Don't worry. We all need our coffee. It is cold. So what has happened since then is that the world looks rather different today. As we speak, as we gather here, maybe a few hours from now in New York, the UN is organizing the Summit of the Future, where there are proposals for countries, for member states to actually issue something radical, something forward-looking about future generations. There is quite a lot of attention on the SDGs, which I would argue is welcome. It was lacking, has been lacking for the last few years. So after 2015, there was considerable enthusiasm. Some governments, India's and China's and Rwanda's, their leaders were actively trying to implement policies. And then there were, I would say, many governments, including in our parts of the world, in the global north, that were sort of lukewarm. They thought, oh, these sustainable development goals, they're for poor countries, they're not for us. Whereas one of the biggest things about the SDGs was that we are all in the same boat. It's not for poor countries or middle-income countries, it's for everyone. So the short story is that the first 4 or 5 years, it takes a while for a new idea to get attention. So there was considerable interest among civil society. One group I found that really embraced the SDGs, and that was the private sector. You had private businesses saying, this is fantastic. This is a roadmap. You have all agreed. Let's just move forward. Whereas we academics were a little bit more skeptical, oh no, not everything is settled. And that is actually my argument today, too, that not everything is settled. But the private sector embraced this. They said, let's operationalize this. And so you saw in the boardrooms, many talk about sustainable development. Many private companies, particularly in Norway or in Europe, but also in China, in India, in America, they were all adopting specific sustainable development goals related to the industry and saying, we are going to promote this. So you saw civil society, you saw many youth movements, you saw many private sector actors adopt it. But my argument today is going to be the following. The way in which we've been looking at sustainable development, the way in which the last 9 years we've been talking about the SDGs is flawed in the sense that we've become quite accustomed to thinking it's all win-win. Let's just do it, as the private sector says. We have this. There's no contradiction. It's almost like it is sanitized from politics. And this win-win narrative, I would argue, is a huge challenge in trying to get us to achieve the SDGs. So the politics of sustainable development has taken a back seat. And what we have perhaps agreed to, or there's been more of a consensus on, is on the technocratic aspects. Let's measure sustainable development. Let's do this, let's do that. But we've really not given enough attention, in my view, that's the argument, on the nitty-gritties of politics, how it plays out, both at the national but also the global level. So my talk today is focused on that, and I sort of three parts. One is just to give you a little overview of the literature, at least some of the stuff that I've contributed to, but also a group of people that I work with, and then to lay out some country examples. And I'll be presenting some new material that I just collected last month, or last 3 weeks, on noise pollution, which I'd like to test out with you. This is the first time I'm presenting this. And then in the final sort of section, I just want to talk about the global politics. Okay, so introduction, national politics, global politics. And so let's just start with, how things look like at the moment. And I'll make sure that these slides are distributed so you don't have to really bother about taking notes. But there was this initial euphoria and optimism. The level of ambition was extremely high. We were going to have a totally new form of global development. We were all going to be in the same boat. It was universality. It was the principles of sustainable development were universal. And there was this idea that, if you remember the definition of sustainable development, it is achieving development for today's generation so that we can meet our current needs without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their needs. And I will say that already there was a contradiction, in the sense that I don't know politics in South Africa as well as I perhaps do in many other parts of the world, but most politicians, at least in democracies, are interested in getting re-elected. And what happens often is that you have policies that are short-term, that are geared towards making your party popular, even though longer-term policies, longer-term outcomes are there in front of you. They're very doable. One tends to choose the short-term goals, the attractive redistribution aspects that will get you the votes. So we've already seen that this focus of sustainable development on future generations, even in richer parts of the world, gets watered down. Let me give you a specific example of my own country, Norway, where for the last 30 years, we've had very cheap electricity. And then the war in the Ukraine started. Our electricity prices skyrocketed. So from being accustomed to cheap electricity at all times, and it is all green, 98% is from hydro, okay? We suddenly had a tenfold increase in electricity prices. We are all driving electric cars, that doesn't help. So there was this huge demand, and suddenly Norwegian households that were so used to using electricity had to, rediscover consumption patterns. We were downloading apps like you have for the power cuts. We were downloading apps. Yeah, this is not for the power cuts. It was more about the prices. I love the fact that you have predictability in this country, right? You know when the power cuts are going to happen, which is not the case in many other parts of the world, because power cuts just happen randomly. I was told you can plan when you're going to charge your phone or iron your shirt. So we were downloading apps, and which we do now, to follow the electricity prices, charge your cars at night. We were changing this. And of course, it helped to have a welfare state with a lot of money that could subsidize these increased in electricity costs. But that led to a change in behavior, because suddenly things that we were accustomed to were not as affordable or cheap anymore. But of course, because the welfare state stepped in, a lot of households just continued using as much, if not, they were using more electricity. So that initial hope we had of consumption being decreased did not take place. But the point is that we still had, in 2015, huge hopes of combining development with environment and climate change. And there has been some success, as I mentioned. There are some examples that we've been studying, including in China, where there's been a serious effort at operationalizing the goals. India the prime minister, as populist as he is, came back from the UN General Assembly in September 2015 and gave a national think tank, and I'll show you an article where you can read more about this, a national think tank, the task of operationalizing these targets. So there have been many attempts across the board of countries saying, these are the global goals, but we need to translate them into local realities. I mentioned Paul Kagame and Rwanda. There's been huge interest in Rwanda on renewable energy, electric car assemblies, you name it, in terms of the transportation, cleanliness in Kigali, if you've been there. So there's a lot of that going on where sustainable development, the SDGs, provided some leaders like Xi Jinping, like Narendra Modi, like Paul Kagame, with a tool to somehow launch their vision. Now, you can question whether these are well-intentioned, whether they're politically motivated. One argument I've had is that politics certainly played a very important role. As you know, in China, the economy was slowing down. This is well before the pandemic. The same thing in India. The informal sector was growing. So when governments don't have very much to offer their citizens, when people are fearful of losing their jobs, so they're not being employment, one very useful tactic for governments is to say, look, we're going to provide, focus on green transitions. We're going to focus on the environment. So don't expect more of this modern development, as in more cars and bridges and roads, etc. We have to also think green. So the SDGs were in a way timely for some politicians. It helped promote their sort of national strategy or vision, which was partially based on the fact that their governments weren't able to deliver the kind of development that people were expecting. But the story that I want to tell you now is that basically what many governments, and I'm sure also in South Africa, has been struggling with, is making the trade-offs. And I mentioned earlier this focus on future generations. You see this right away. Most governments, most politicians will tell you, we're interested in making sure people are well off today. And when you speak to people living in poverty, it is somewhat of a luxury to talk about 10 years from now, 20 years from now. In my part of the world, we're talking about long-termism, how the world will look like 300 years from now. In our parts of the world, it is common to talk about this. We're talking about the future of the planet. But for somebody who's struggling to earn enough. I saw a fantastic poster today in traffic when Manu and I were driving. There was a guy with a poster saying, I'm hungry. If you help me now, I don't want to steal, but give me food. It was a wonderful way of saying, hey, come on, you can prevent theft by giving me money today. So if you have somebody struggling and can't find enough to eat, it makes perhaps little sense to talk about these long-term goals. And so for governments to make those trade-offs is often a huge challenge. And I'll show you some cases soon. Then this thing about collective action, how do we get not just civil society, not just youth movements? You've seen the power of youth. Just look what happened in Bangladesh. They got rid of a government, right? There's student protests. And this is happening in many, many parts of the world. So the youth are very much in it. Civil society is talking about it. But I don't see political parties necessarily engaging on sustainable development. We have some green parties in Europe. We have a very influential party in Norway called the MDG, the Green Party of Norway. But their voter base is mainly the urban areas. We don't really see them, getting this kind of national importance. And we also see a very interesting trend now. Most parties, at least in my country, Norway, they're adopting something related to climate change. So the green parties, who were first very unique and only talking about climate change, their agenda has become a little watered down in the sense that many other parties have also started talking about it. But mainstream parties are not just talking about climate or sustainable development, they're also talking about economic growth. They're talking about poverty reduction. So we don't see that kind of political embrace. So collective action is turning out to be a problem. And also, we don't really see as much attention on politicians or their parties being held to account for failing to promote sustainable development. So again, sustainable development is seen win-win. Everybody says SDGs are good, and you can wear this very attractive pin here. A lot of people wonder what that is. Is this some secret club? But everybody, talks about the SDGs in a positive sense, but nobody really, very few talk about why we haven't achieved as much success as we should have. And by the way, much of this was not working before the pandemic. A lot of people blame the pandemic for all the bad things, but we were off track in relation to achieving the SDGs before the pandemic. And at the moment, it's 14% of the targets are on track. So we're not doing very well. Let me show you a study you can read in Nature Sustainability, just published a few years ago by my colleague Frank Biermann and his team. And Frank and I, we've been collaborating also on other things I'll show you. And they did a review of around 3,000 scientific articles, including some of the ones that I've written. And their goal was to see whether the SDGs have had political impact. And the short story is that no. The short story is that the SDGs have had discursive impact. So civil society, governments are talking about the SDGs and they're seeping into national development strategies. But the question is, has the SDGs really changed how governments do and go about their business? In most of the literature, you'll find that most governments are just repackaging what they were doing earlier on and putting an SDG label, right? SDG proofing. This is what most governments do in any case. Poverty, climate, If you want to apply for something, you have to use these buzzwords. To what extent they're serious. I was tweeting about this event just half an hour ago, and a colleague of mine wrote, what we should really discuss is the world better off because of the SDGs? I mean, just the counterfactual. What would the world look like today had we not had the SDGs? I think that's an interesting thought experiment. So the conclusion of this piece is that the SDGs haven't really changed politics. There hasn't really been a very substantial impact in the legal sphere, in the political sphere. But what we do see are sort of information campaigns and maybe even propaganda and the repackaging of existing policies to make them sound as if they are new and promoting the SDGs. So last year, Frank and his team, and I was part of this, we wrote a piece in Science magazine suggesting 4 reforms for the SDGs. And this is something that we are also pushing now for the UN to be more aware of. We are trying to create Twitter hashtags and trying to get policymakers to listen to us. And the 4 things we suggest, I'm sorry, it's a very small, maybe you can't read it, but basically saying that we really need to change the way in which we do things. It's nice to be all in the same boat, but maybe we should hold richer countries to higher standards than every country being on the same boat. So that's one of the things, differentiation. We want there to be the level of expectation needs to be changed, because we can just do the barest minimum and feel like we are on track. But those who have polluted the most historically and have benefited the most must do more and not just hide behind these universal targets. So that's one thing. And maybe, we can name and shame some of these countries more. The second has to do with making these indicators and targets more dynamic. Making sure that we update the way in which we measure, the way in which these are portrayed, whether it's what is working, what is not. We also think that some of the SDGs, maybe we should make them obligatory, maybe legalize them in the sense that have a treaty. It could be on plastic pollution. And as you know, if you sign on the dotted line, if something is binding, then you can extract accountability. The trouble with sustainable development or the SDGs, by and large, they're voluntary. And if something is voluntary, then you're praised if you do it, but if you don't do it, you're not criticized. It's a bit like charity, If you give, wonderful, you're generous. If you don't give, nobody will say anything. But if it's something based on a duty, you've signed on the dotted line, then things look different. Then you can hold people to account. So on some SDGs, maybe we can have a binding declaration. So that's one way. And finally, institutionalization. There's something called the High-Level Political Forum that happens in New York every July. I've attended 2 of those and been very underwhelmed. They, for me, are a talking club. You have countries presenting their so-called voluntary national reviews, presenting all the good things that they've done, and they have a little bit, 1 or 2 paragraphs on things they could have done better. And the way it works is that you are going to have, just like, when you present your work, you have peer review. So you have others providing you with comments. But as we know from our own students, this is always a fun experiment. When I ask my students to provide critical feedback to their colleagues, the first thing they will say is, oh, this is a fantastic piece of work. Everything, I've never read a better essay. You could maybe do a little bit more here, but it's really good. So the question is, why do they say that? And as you can guess, they do it because they don't want to be criticized themselves. And that is how it works in New York. I've even heard people in the corridor say, hey, you are going to give me comments and, make sure you're not too harsh on me. And if that is how it works, then the mechanism, the institutional mechanism is weak. So we suggest creating more of a dynamic way. So you can have a look at that. And then Manu mentioned this conference that we co-sponsored and hosted at Utrecht just a few weeks ago. So we've come up with the Utrecht roadmap, and we suggest that we really need to focus on stronger global governance. And I'll show you later, one of the ways in which I think the 2030 agenda has failed is that we really haven't had much of an effect on global governance, the way in which multinational, multilateral institutions work, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, all those initial hopes have been somewhat dashed. So something about global governance is going to be important, but also local coordination. As I mentioned earlier in the Science magazine article, making the targets more dynamic, updating the targets. And also there's been quite a lot of interest, and this is where, some of you may or may not agree, on the GDP model of development. In Europe, there's quite a lot of focus on degrowth, how we should, I'm looking at you, Margaret, it'll be fantastic to hear your thoughts on degrowth, to how we can actually, come up with more sustainable ways of living and welfare that is just not obsessed with increase in GDP. And this, my friends, is not something that I hear much talk about in the so-called global South. In the Indias and Chinas, or even on the African continent, most governments are talking about growing their economies. That is the key to job creation. In Europe, there is increasingly, I wouldn't say a major movement, but among some academics, much more of a focus on degrowth. So in February of this year, we met here in Future Africa, and we launched this cluster of research excellence on the politics of sustainable development. I'm sure many of you would be interested in joining. We've now just received funding from the MasterCard Foundation for 40 PhD students a year. I don't know how we're going to manage this. That's a lot. And we also need to find financing for faculty members to be involved. But anyway, this is what we're doing together with UP and Future Africa. And we also have a major research project planned. So that was very quickly, sorry, that was a longish introduction or first part. So what about then democracy and the politics of sustainable development? I mentioned to you the argument is that we're not talking enough. And I wrote this piece a couple of years ago comparing India with China in order to highlight, the role of politics and, of course, the isolate the benefits or the added value of democracy. There's no better comparison. If you look at any development indicator today, China is far ahead of India. They started at the same time in terms of economic development, 47 in India, after independence, 48 in China. And for many years, they were, going at the same rate. China had a huge famine between 1958 and 61, so-called during the Great Leap Forward. An estimated 15 to 35 million people died. But since then, since the 1990s, with the liberalization of the Chinese economy, China has become this global economic superpower. India has had some success, but not nearly the kind of success as China. Of course, you can say democracy is slow. Democracy is good for many things, but not for radical growth. Most of the highest growers have been typical non-democracies, but democracies are slow and steady, and perhaps they will win the race. Who knows? But one of the things I was writing about in this article had to do with pollution control. Now, you know that New Delhi and Beijing are the two of the most polluted cities historically. And what China did is something that India copied later on. China started introducing a radical initiative of making sure, because people were getting richer, they were all buying cars, and you have to actually win a lottery in a way to buy a car in China because there are so many people and so many cars. So you could only drive on some days depending on the last digit of your license plate. So they were trying to regulate the traffic before the Olympics in 2008, before any very important event. The air radically improves in China because the government says, we'll close down these highly polluting industries, and the air miraculously improves in Beijing. But the point is that in terms of transportation, China did quite a lot of impressive stuff. And I was in Beijing for the first time in 4 years, 2 months ago. Pretty impressive. You can actually see blue skies, etc. So there is something about the power of the centralized state in China to implement and get things done. And there's quite a lot of focus now on blue skies. When you've achieved a certain level of economic development, you want something else. There was even this gimmick by a Norwegian company once a few years ago. They were selling, a can of fresh Norwegian air that you could spray in China. So when you have a certain level of development, you want something more. And that's what the Chinese are striving for. New Delhi tried to do something similar, okay? They had something called the odd and even days, again, based on the last digits of your car. But this is a democracy. And politics kicks in a different way. You have civil society activists saying, we need to do something about pollution control. But there are also many other actors who say, this is unconstitutional, you can't impose this infringes on my freedom. To cut a long story short, this never really, in New Delhi, had the same kind of impact as it did in China. So, and there are many, many other stories that I can tell you. Let me go on to a different kind of response, and just to see politics playing out differently. This is another case that I've been studying and writing about. So this area, Lamu, you may have heard of this, Kenya, UNESCO historical site, beautiful place. The government of Kenya decided, we need electricity. And the country really needs more electricity generation. What are we going to do? We're going to build a coal-fired power plant there with backing from an international consortium, with Chinese technology, some Chinese money, and we're going to build this. And this was a very heavy top-down based development model. The government, in all fairness, is desperate, as in many other countries on the continent. They want to do something. And this was there. The Chinese are willing to build this. Mind you, this is before 2017. That's when China decided, by the way, to not build any more coal-fired power plants on the African continent. Actually, outside China, they're not building anything. But the story is a little older. So the government of Kenya says, let's go ahead. So they started building, etc. But they actually went against the wishes of the local population. I have to say that the local population in Lamu was divided. Some of them said, this is great. Jobs, roads, schools, buildings, this is going to create well-being. But another group said, but we have to learn from South Africa. They went on some visits here and they saw this is highly polluting. Is this what we want? When there are so many other renewable alternatives available. Again, to cut the long story short, hugely impressive civil society, academia, local activists got together, protests, petitions, international attention. Newspapers were writing about it. And this project was shelved. This went to court. And Kenya's National Tribunal, Environmental Tribunal, said that this project should not be allowed to continue. But here's the punchline. The court did not highlight the environmental or the detrimental effects of this coal-fired power plant. The technical aspect that the court hung itself up on, was focused on, is that this project did not involve adequate consultation with local communities. Because of the lack of consultation, this cannot be allowed to happen. For the activists, it did not make a difference whether climate was cited or this. The very fact that this project has been shelved is testament to this power of politics, mobilization, collective action. So this is a good story in that sense. Now, no alternative has come up. So in a sense, you can also say, well, what is the benefit to local communities? Because the government has shelved this project and there's nothing else that has come up that is more renewable. So in terms of electricity, in terms of development, Lamu remains more or less the same. Another thing that I've been studying, which illustrates a different kind of politics. I'm on my way to Malawi. I've been studying Malawi for the last 19, 20 years. And officially, as soon as I land in Blantyre, the first thing I will see are these charcoal bags that are sold openly. Malawi has a huge problem with energy security. Only 10, 11% of the population is actually connected to the grid. And even then, if you think you have problems with power cuts, I mean, Malawi is a totally different ball game. There really isn't much power. A lot of it is hydro-based, but when the Shire River, there's not enough water, a lot of this equipment is old. There really isn't much energy. So one thing is how many people are connected to the grid. The other thing has to do with just power generation. So what do? How do you cook? Is there natural gas? No, there is some being imported from South Africa. So firewood and charcoal are the main means to cook, to warm water. It's absolutely a very crucial part of daily living. But here's the interesting part. Most of the charcoal that is sold in Malawi is illegal, is illegally produced. And what we've seen over the last 15, 20 years is enormous deforestation, where local communities, because they don't have very many other alternatives, are burning down the forests, cutting the trees, making small pyres, making charcoal, selling them in small plastic bags, and most of this makes its way to Blantyre, Lilongwe, all the urban centers. Some of it is also imported from Mozambique. So the irony is that you have the international community, donors, including my own country, Norway, everybody says, this is really bad. We have to do something about climate change. We can't have deforestation. Charcoal should be banned. And the government of Malawi, which I love Malawi, but it's also a country that is heavily donor dependent. So donors have a huge influence. Basically did the donors' bidding. They banned charcoal. Most of it is illegal. But what is the reality? There is a ban that is not implemented, that is not really enacted. It's not possible to do this. And that's why In front of a police station, you will see something like bags of charcoal that are illegal, right? And so here is a case of a policy which is well-intentioned to promote sustainable development, to combat deforestation, that is not implementable in practice because there is no alternative. So again, that's where the politics comes in. We want to stop something bad from happening, but if we aren't able to come up with an alternative, why would somebody stop doing this bad stuff? And so to tell people, don't use charcoal, and then to tell them, but you have no other alternative, I mean, that is a policy that is not going to get us very well. So I think a lot of the international community, the donors, have to really rethink this. Well-intentioned policies in the absence of alternatives is not very good. So this is, again, it's fun because I've often stopped by these roadsides and talked to these people selling this, and you would have NGOs, police officers, political leaders, all coming with their pickup trucks, filling their cars with charcoal that is illegal. Okay, the final part, and this is stuff I was doing in India, in Calcutta, just a few weeks ago. 2-3 weeks ago. I was there for 1 month. And what you're seeing basically is a planned city called Salt Lake City. This is not in Utah. It's actually in Calcutta, India. It was built on land that was reclaimed from a lake, Salt Lake, in the 50s and 60s. And it is very well planned. You see the roads are straight, there are footpaths, there are roundabouts, everyone has, buildings are all very similar, uniform. It is like any planned city that you would like to go to. It's not as chaotic as other parts of Calcutta. By the way, if you don't know Calcutta, it's a city of 20, 30, 40, nobody knows how many million, but it's a huge city, and has enormous challenges related to pollution of different types. But what we're seeing here, and actually this has a personal story for me because my parents, I was born in India, my parents were one of the first to move into the city. And because my father was ill and I had to look after him for a month, I ended up being there and doing some of these walks every day. You know, I had to get my points. And before I enrolled myself in a gym, I was walking around like, 10, 12 kilometers. And I was observing what the city has become, this planned city, over the last 30, 40 years. I left this place 35 years ago. And what I found was pretty shocking because what we do see in this planned city is quite a lot of focus on plastic pollution control. So no more plastic bags. There's a lot of focus on air pollution control. People are talking about garbage disposals. Everything is collected. You have different containers, just like we have in Norway. So on many, many indicators, this was fantastic. But on other indicators, and this is one I wanted to show you. I was shocked. It was just mind-boggling. It was, people were honking all the time. Okay? And even in traffic. I don't know how it is. Do you have this also here sometimes? Not as much. So I'm doing this walk every day and I'm thinking, wow, on many indicators, this is going on. Why? I mean, my first instance is, to get really irritated. I'm walking on the street, but there is no footpath. So I'm on the street and then there are cars there's nobody else. There's no other car, but you have to honk. And the reason you do that is, it's just mind-boggling. I've been talking to Uber drivers. I've been talking to everyone. You honk because in case there's somebody coming out of nowhere. You honk because you're announcing your arrival. You honk because you're frustrated, you're angry. You honk because your hand is always on that horn. You honk because you're just preventing. But there are also actually quite valid reasons why you honk. This planned city with footpaths have been overtaken. So every house, and this is the politics, every house has you see, these are actually footpaths for you to walk on. It is either construction or there's a tree, which is nice to have, but not blocking the footpath. There are cars that are parked. People have occupied what was supposed to be these common spaces. So there's actually a very valid reason why we are seeing this honking. One is, of course, all of this frustration I was telling you about, or the culture that you have to honk. And I was actually asking a lot of people, can you do a thought experiment? What would happen if we just cut out all these horns? And they said it'll be chaos. We'll have lots of accidents, In Norway, we have this problem with our kids, not just kids, even us, with headphones. Walking on the streets, no idea. And to make things worse, we have electric cars that don't make noise. So how do you know somebody is coming, right? And we don't horn. I mean, that'll be scary. So this is what they're saying here, that people are just used to. The only reason they'll move is if you honk. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is that the way in which pedestrians have been pushed onto the road. Of course, there's a huge explosion of cars. There's a huge explosion in population. All of this is contributing to this culture. But what is interesting, is that while society and politicians talk about air pollution, they talk about plastic pollution, very few people are talking about noise pollution. And it turns out this is a huge problem in India. It's the noisiest country, one of the noisiest countries in the world. There's always sound. And there's something that I'm obsessed with, is not having sound. Yesterday, I had to move my room at the hotel because this was next to the pool and the DJ was going full blast. And I'd specifically asked for a quiet room, and they gave me this one. So, and then they finally found a room way, down for these boring people like me. But because I'm obsessed, I want just peace of mind. And this is what a lot of kids are suffering from. People are getting more and more deaf. So you're creating, we try to solve one problem and then we create another one. And the reason why this is happening is because local politicians, including the municipality of Salt Lake City, have turned a blind eye. You can construct, you can obstruct, you can do whatever you want. You're allowed. So you have powerful lobbies of people, residents associations saying, no, we have to continue this. We'll take over these public spaces. We'll force people on the streets. And it turns out, this is the other thing, it was only people like me walking or poor people. Most people are becoming so rich now, they're driving everywhere, which is also another problem, right? You're not getting enough attention and enough exercise. I'm sorry, I'm going to just very quickly touch on the last point, which is the global politics. I'm sorry it's going a little too fast, and maybe we can have a discussion later on. So I was giving you sort of snippets of examples from these countries, India, China, Malawi, many other parts of the world we can talk about. But what about the global level? Here, too, we find a contradiction in terms of the role of politics in sustainable development. So we have a lot of hypocrisy in the global north, including in our parts of the world. And this affects particularly the African continent. Energy, as you know, is a huge problem. Energy security, you want electricity. A lot of countries are saying, it doesn't matter how we produce electricity, just like Kenya. It doesn't have to be clean, as long as, because we need it now. We can't wait. If somebody's offering us a cheap coal-fired power plant, it'd be stupid to say no. But the global north is saying, no, you should not do that. So Mozambique and Senegal, you have a lot of trillions and trillions of liters of natural gas. The global north is saying, don't take the gas out of the ground because that is not sustainable. Go for renewable energy. Uganda is saying, we found oil. We want to mine this oil. We want to take it out of the ground. Rich countries are saying, don't do that. That'll be bad. And so what we're seeing is increasingly a lot of pushback from politicians in Africa, particularly saying, you're not giving us the alternative. It's a bit like the Malawi charcoal example. You're telling us to stop doing this, but what are we going to do? Where's the investments in solar in green hydrogen, or in hydro, we just don't have enough investments coming in. So we have to, should we tell our citizens, you have to wait for green technology to come? And so we're seeing this hypocrisy in the sense that we in the global north, we still rely on fossil fuels. Norway, I mean, our whole economy is very, very dependent on outsourcing our pollution. We're very good at having a clean environment with electric cars, and the oil is used by somebody else. And so when Norway says, don't, tells African countries, don't use natural gas, then that message does not resonate as well. It does not have that credibility. And we see this in the US. If President Trump is reelected, it's bad enough already in the US. All environmental protections, all subsidies for electric cars, they may all disappear. So you're having this kind of an inward focus, even in Germany, in many parts of Europe, in the UK. All these positive green transitions many of them have been backtracked in terms of coal-fired power plants, in terms of many, many things. When push comes to shove, then we stop thinking about sustainable development. The politics says survive, make sure that the voters are happy. So I think we really need to take a step back and to question this so-called willingness of the international community to support sustainable development, not just within their own countries, but also outside. The final point I want to make is this, an Economist article, a recent one from yesterday or something. 74% of the world's poorest countries were able to attract only 24% of bilateral aid. No, sorry, 17%. 74% of the world's poorest countries were able to attract only 17% of bilateral aid from the global north. So somehow the money is not going to countries that really need it. So I think there's quite a lot of work we need to do. So let me leave it at that. The argument so far is we've made progress. We have 6 years left. We are talking about the future. Most people say that the SDGs, we may achieve some of them, but we really need to double up our efforts. We need more money, and there isn't enough money. But most importantly, I'm trying to argue is that we've created a narrative that if only we do this and that, we'll achieve them. And we've ignored the politics and the difficult, the uncomfortable questions related to the fact that not everybody is for sustainable development. What a lot of people are for is to improve the livelihoods of people at the moment, but that could come at the cost of future generations, if not the same current generation just a few years, a few days, a few weeks down the line. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. I may have gone a bit over time. I apologize.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan, for this talk. I just wish we had more time to get all these stories, but we have more time to ask questions, engage you. So we're going to have a question and answer session now. We will take questions in, we'll collect them in phases, the first group, second group. Those who are online, could you please raise your hand if you want to ask the questions? And if you want to ask the question, if you want to write the question, we will get it read out. If you want to ask the question yourself, raise up the hand and we will give you the opportunity to do so. Yeah. So Peter, I can't see you, but I hope you can see me. Any questions? There was a question that was directed to the Dean. And we're delighted that the Dean can attend this seminar, actually. Thank you, Margaret. Okay, I'm going to collect 3 questions, and I'll collect 3 questions, and then the speaker will respond to them.
Thank you so much. So Dan, always a pleasure to listen to you. What a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. I agree with Mano. I could stay here all day and listen to your stories. Thank you. I have a few comments and then I have a question. Of course, in terms of the degrowth, I think you answered it yourself. When you have achieved, I think, a certain level of development, then you want more. We can't even, I mean, a few years ago, economists, we were talking about what about happiness and not only just GDP. The point is we're not there yet. We need the numbers. We need growth. That's really the most basic. The cake has to be there. It's not there yet. Once we have the cake and it's big enough, we can start talking about whether to decorate it or to put a little chocolate on top and so on. That's my view in terms of that. I think that's why you don't hear many economists on this side talking about a different type of growth than GDP. I just wanted to brag a little bit because I have an opportunity from time to time, once a year, to meet with Frank, your co-author at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Of course, you and the work that Frank has done is won just a few weeks ago, or last week, the Volvo Environment Prize. So congratulations to the whole team. There, the work that you have been doing shows that these big organizations, let's talk about the UN, which you also mentioned, and all these very expensive meetings that are happening, the one you mentioned happening just now, are essentially, if we put it very frankly, useless. Okay, a waste of money, people meeting together, just talking and not criticizing each other. So my question then to you is, when you had suggested the 4 new ideas, including legalization and stronger institutions, practically who would do this? Because these things are funded, and the funder has always the upper hand to say, no, we're not doing it like this, or like the UN. So how do you suggest that we go about, let's say after 2030, having a strong institution that governs everybody and legalizing some of these SDG or whatever new things would come in the future? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Can I just see the 3 hand, Niraj? And okay, I'll take 4 then. So so let's start with Niraj here. We just go down the line. Okay, is that okay?
Dan, and I want to perhaps add 5th dimension to the and link it to the politics at a national level. And so when we look at our 17 goals with 140 some odd targets and 1,000 some odd indicators, etc., it's all very rational, right? And we're the weird ones who think slowly, as Daniel Kahneman would say. But the voting electorate, which politicians have mastered in mobilizing, are fast thinkers, guttural, emotional, etc. And that's why the Trumps and Zumas and Berlusconis of the world have succeeded, because they've appealed to people in that sort of way. Take something as rational as this and make it an emotive issue for people to get around and use it as a tool for politicians to leverage support from industry, from the general population, etc.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And it's a topic which is new to me until I met Manu a few months ago. You mentioned some very important points in the discussion. And one of them was, up to now, politics has taken a back seat in the implementation of the SDGs. And we have like few years left, about 6 years. And you mentioned that about 14% of the targets have been achieved. On track. Okay. Now, my question is, now that the politics has been on the back seat all this while, and the politicians have got this short term, as you've made it, up to the next election, their targets, their implementation. If you want to talk to them so they can hear you, you talk to them at what should happen until the next elections. But what we have here is a long-term problem. How do we then now take the politics from the back seat to the front seat so that at least we improve the number of those targets that should be on track?
Yeah, thank you once again for a very interesting talk. What I wonder whether you will give some comment if a government has to change the way people live. It's got a major lever, and that is taxation. And you never mentioned taxation. I'm asking you, in other words, there's an unholy alliance between capital and governments, and that is why we have Trump. And you only have to see the effect of the oil industry on the election in America. It's terrible, and it's absolutely totally crazy. So taxation surely is something that one has to address. And for the moment, the governments draw up the tax to make the profits because they fund their campaigns. So there's got to be a movement to shift the taxation, for example, and it's mentioned before. It's not to create new taxes because that's not popular, but to say we're going to take tax away from your salary and we're going to put it on petrol. Surely that is the correct way, because then you give more freedom to the individual. Because now he can reorganize and save on petrol and travel by bicycle to his car, but he's not being punished because he sees the dividends.
I'll try and remember. So let me start with you, sir. You're absolutely correct. So one of the things I forgot to mention in that review article that Bierman and his colleagues did about the political impact, they also find there's all very insignificant change in relation to financial resources that national governments have earmarked for the SDGs. So if there's very little money, it's obvious that it's not going to work. So you're absolutely right about taxation. We see this in our parts of the world where you have more sort of leftist parties talking about increasing taxation. But if you see Europe now, we're having a right-wing wave. And so there is this sort of a dance between those who say we need to put more into the state coffers by way of taxes, which could then be allocated for green growth, for the green transition. And then we have other groups in politics saying, oh, look at what has happened with the pandemic. Look at the Ukraine war. You know, our economies are tanking. The global south with China is taking over. We need to create more jobs. And industry needs tax incentives. So don't tax us, give us rather incentives. This is the global north. In Malawi, you would have another situation where the government is so desperate to attract investments that it's saying basically, I'll give you everything for free, just come and invest, even though these investments are not really generating benefits to the local population. So absolutely, I think for something to be successful, you need to have the financial resources, and taxation is one way. That is where I suppose the Nordic model, has some important implications of how our taxes, sometimes we complain, why is 50% of my tax cut before I even get the money in my account? And then, of course, when I do see that my children go to school and it's free, they go to university, it's free. If I need surgery, it's free. Then you realize, okay, there's something going on. By the way, not everything works. The road in front of my house is really bad. And so my youngest son, who's 16, soon 17, wrote a letter to the municipality saying, why is this road not being fixed? And what we have is like patchwork, every time somebody just fills a little pothole, it's really bad. It's like, it could be in any low-income country context. And then he got a letter back from the municipality saying, no, your road is not on our list of priorities. And so that led to us feeling a bit disgruntled. Why are we paying so much taxes? But the point is that when you have a credible state providing social services, then the willingness to provide tax also increases. And what we see in many parts of the world is this reluctance to give some of your income in taxation is because you feel it's being stolen. It's not working. And so there's something about trust You trust the government. And we saw this during the pandemic. If the government said wear masks, you listen to the government if you trusted the government. If you didn't trust the government, it's like, why should I listen to you? So I think there's something about social trust, taxation, but you're absolutely right. Without that, we're not going to really get much far. Sure. To actually pay, no, but just to pay what you're supposed to pay. In many, many parts of Europe, people don't pay taxes. It's an informal economy in many parts. I can go to southern Italy and they want euros in cash rather than a bank transfer for obvious reasons. So, okay, Neeraj, I got carried away. Your thing was about politicians, how to make the rational into more sort of emotional and act. And that is exactly what we propose in some of the new research coming out of this cluster. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is to understand how the research we do here and all the IPCC reports, all the UN Sustainable Development annual reports, how they are filtered, digested, understood by politicians and their assistants. Because we think just because there's a report saying this, and usually the reports, the news reports that follow these scientific reports are all scary, doom and gloom. It's getting worse, it's getting hotter, all of this. And I, as a layman, may sometimes think, I don't want to read this. I want to move on to the next page. This is unpleasant. Is that how politicians do? How do they actually digest that information? I think we need to better understand the cognitive processes, the abilities to take this complex information and then to somehow develop political strategies for implementation. I have been told by many bureaucrats in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway and also elsewhere, when I say, but we wrote about this, they said, oh yeah, but we don't have time to read your article. At the most, we can read the abstract. And I've often thought that we as academics need to do a better job to translate the research into, to communicate our research. I started a podcast called In Pursuit of Development. It's given me enormous, I wouldn't say influence, but I have listeners in 160 countries. I'm reaching groups that they wouldn't read my books and articles. The podcast apparently is a great way because you're running and you're jogging, you're cooking, and even politicians and UN officials listen to my podcast. So maybe that's one way to communicate. But my thing is that we don't know enough. I totally agree with you. I would like to know how the Zumas and all your presidents and ministers understand the the evidence, and then what is seen to be politically important. Take power cuts here. If there's one thing I know that you guys are interested in is having safe, continued access to electricity. And if I was the president, that's the number one thing I would think is important. South Africa is part of BRICS. There's all this wonderful positive notion. You're a big developed country. You're getting middle income. You're doing so much. You're the biggest economy on the continent. And yet you're facing this thing and people are laughing at South Africa in other parts. So why wouldn't that government do that? And I'm told the criticism is that there is a plan, but nobody knows what happened to that plan. How is it being implemented? So that for me is just so natural that if you had this problem that is being articulated by people, why not act upon that? So the question would be, why did the South African government not come up with a better, viable energy policy earlier when it had time, right? So to trace that process, I think would perhaps give us some idea of how politicians think. It's just, I don't know, you guys can maybe answer this better. Margaret, thank you for your reflections. Your question about how do we actually get that kind of treaty, right? That legalization, who's going to do it? I can badmouth the UN quite a lot, but I'm also willing to accept that there's no other international grouping that enjoys the convening power that the UN has. And we see this, I was interacting with the group, the G77 group of developing countries in the UN. There's a hugely powerful, influential grouping. They have their own agenda against so-called the global north. And then you also have the Security Council, which is very divided. Many global South countries want to be part of that Security Council. But the General Assembly of the UN is still seen to be the closest we come to a representative world grouping. And so whenever there is the need to do anything significant, like in 2015 with the 2030 Agenda, 193 leaders agreed on this, on these very ambitious goals, 17 goals. But the reason why they also agreed, Margaret, as you know, is because they were not binding, right? So this is the paradox. If you create a voluntary mechanism, then I'm willing to sign up. If you're going to hold me to account, oh, come on, the US will be the first to pull out. And without the US, how are we going to do anything? There's still, whenever the US coughs, we're worried. What's happening to my mortgage? What's happening to in the American economy shapes my mortgage payments. So I think the question is not necessarily replacing the UN, but more of how to make the UN more powerful. When I talk to UN officials, they say member states have consistently undermined the UN by not paying its dues. Many countries don't pay what they're supposed to pay the UN. So to defund the UN, to remove, we saw this during the pandemic, the World Health Organization suddenly saw a huge shortfall in finance. Some countries said they don't deserve to be funded. So I think it is more about strengthening the UN. Some of the reforms that have been undertaken haven't been successful, but to supplement this in order to make something legally binding with this kind of civil society action that we see, collective action from the grassroots. So something along those lines. We see this, there's a lot of activism in Africa, but also elsewhere. You saw Greta Thunberg, how one girl could have so much influence. Now, Greta Thunberg and her generation are not getting that kind of attention now, but they were able to generate quite a lot of attention, even though that did not lead to any legalization. So I don't really have a good answer to your thing, but maybe a bit of everything, but not necessarily replacing the UN. I don't see others. What I do see is you have several other multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the IMF are the most important and most influential. They have convening power, not the same kind of legitimacy as the UN, and sometimes they are working in competition rather than together. And so this is something I noticed. We were doing a report for the Norwegian government last year on funding sustainable development. And one of the funny things was in many of the meetings we had, the UN people would say, don't give money to the World Bank. And the World Bank would say, don't give money to these UN organizations. And then the UN organizations themselves said, don't give money to that other UN organization, give it to us. So you have this dysfunctional system where there's competition, not unlike universities, right? We all want stuff for our centers, this mentality has to stop. So I think there's reforms, more collaboration, but also bottom-up processes would be the way to go. And so your question, I think, was related to his in terms of how do we get that political change. And I want to pose the question back to you. What would get, if you looked at the Sustainable Development Goals, what is most important for you here today in Pretoria, in South Africa? Is it Sustainable Development Goal 7 on clean energy? Is it SDG 10 on inequality? Is it income inequality reduction that is important? Is it 1, 2, and 3 on poverty, food, and health? Is it 4? Is it education? Are you thinking about the climate? Or do you not worry about where the energy comes from as long as you have electricity that is affordable? I think the way in which voters themselves vote, you see, the biggest power we have as voters is to give our vote to the party or the leader who closest resembles or will take care of what we think are our interests. And this is where we see many young, highly educated people in Europe with interest in climate, etc., are voting for the Green parties. And then the Green parties themselves are realizing that they themselves can't alone govern, So if they're part of a coalition, they're trying to influence other parties to do their bidding. You know, it's like a compromise. So we see something happening. We've seen something like that also in relation to anti-corruption campaigns in Asia, for example. Many social movements have transformed into political parties. The Aam Aadmi Party, the Common Man's Party in India, became very popular because it campaigned against corruption. It's a paradox that they themselves are being accused of corruption now. But you see social movements turning into political, powerful groups. If that is possible, maybe you could also have that happen here. But I think the two of you and your questions are very related. And I think we really need, I hate to say this, more research on better understanding how politicians think, how they prioritize, even if it is just meant to garner more votes. If you're really interested in me solving the energy crisis, if I do something about it, obviously I will win the election. Because I can say, this is what you wanted me to do, I did it. The question is, why did they not do it? You know, and that is the fundamental question we need to ask, because you are making your demands very clear and they are not being acted upon. And the question is, why not? Are there other actors who are more influential than you? Are their demands being taken care of? Are the people who don't want to pay more taxes, are their demands being taken care of? Not those who actually really need your help. So I think that's where I hope our core, Mano, can do much more innovative work trying to figure this out. I hope I've answered the four.
Okay, thanks very much. Now we're going to take another round. Okay. Okay.
So we'll unmute Johannes.
Okay, I've done that.
Yes, we can hear you. Ask the question, Johannes.
Yes, thanks, Prof. Mano. First, I have to thank you, Prof. Mano, for allowing us the opportunity to participate in this wonderful topic. And I also like to thank Professor Dan Banik for providing the granular details of the complexity of the world of humanity. Now, on the basis of the presentation of those details, I'm asking a question. I'll ask that question and then try to provide some kind of a rationale, which he has provided anyway. But my question then is, are we not facing a problem where we should be thinking about questions as to whether the world framing, for a lack of a better word, the world matrices, the way the world is framed to operate, may be the locus of the factors that disable or limit the ability of, whether you're talking national, regional, or you are talking the international community, is unable to make good progress, if you will, on the sustainable development. Or if I were to be extreme to say, is it not the framing of the world that will make sustainable development goals to never be achieved in this world? And my point is, from the African perspective, African futures are highly contested. And what we know is that when you have private capital, Prof, being so interested in something, why are we not immediately raising red flags? And my point is, we probably would agree with the sentiment that when private capital participates, it will always do so for a specific interest group. And I would not go into details with that argument, but we know that private capital, capitalism, is able to resolve its own contradictions through reflexivity. Didn't the private capital take up this issue in order to make corrections on its own contradiction. And this is the reason, Prof, why I'm asking that question. Today, we know in Africa, as I said, I'm focusing in Africa, specifically sub-Saharan South Africa. Most states and regimes are bent towards securing international legitimacy. Where are the interests of the voters there? And why is that so? But my question is still that first one. The politics of democratization governance in Africa are inevitably linked to the relations with corporatism, the relations with capitalism. And we can avoid that. And we know that democratization in Africa involves incompetence, corruption, which is associated with the toxicity of private money in democratic politics. That is my question. But what I've provided was just a background to try to justify my question. Don't we want to change the world is framed?
Thank you very much, Johannes. I wish you were here so you can have an engagement with the speaker over tea. It's a long discussion. Thank you. The speaker will respond to that. We're going to, is another person online?
Yes, so these are written questions. It's from Gitude Rachel. It says, what's your take on the over-reliance of global south countries on development aid to implement SDGs, especially those geared towards environmental sustainability, and how this tips the power balance of who drives the discourse of sustainable development? And then another one from Daselin, Amlaku Kukisa. So he says, contrary to the MDG era, conflicts and wars have been on the rise worldwide. Many nations are embroiled in conflicts, and as a result, some have been regressed beyond their ability to sustain the gains made during the MDGs. So the question then is, if it's not possible to avoid conflicts and wars, then what role can national and international politics play in figuring out how to achieve the SDGs in the midst of them? Do you believe that countries engulfed in war and crises may still make progress with the SDGs?
Okay, thanks. These are big questions. And I'm going to ask Dan to respond to them before I take the next round. And Dan, if you could be shorter, and that will help.
That's
Thanks.
my problem. I need to improve. I need to come up with short, crisp responses. One of the questions from the audience, from the online audience about aid, yes, particularly in, I quoted this statistic that 74% of the world's poorest countries has only been able to attract 17% of bilateral aid, which is a big problem. And again, just to give the context of Malawi, which is very heavily aid dependent, and this relates to the previous question on taxation. When one has limited resources, one tends to prioritize differently, and climate and environment don't get, it's higher up in the ladder. So you end up prioritizing fertilizer subsidies, food security. Those are the first things that governments think about. And they hope that donor countries through aid will be able to do something on deforestation, charcoal ban, etc. But if the national governments do not put their political interest in these policies, they're not going to work. You can't have aid donors deciding and influencing policy. So one. And the other question from the online person, yes, conflicts are on the rise. And one good case of how conflicts are playing out, I have a student working on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This is a huge conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt, but also now Somalia is getting involved in Sudan. And you see the narrative of sustainable development very different. It has to do with controlling the access to the Nile. Which country has historically benefited from the Nile waters? Egypt. Ethiopia is saying, we now want to develop. We are building this dam with our own resources, not with Chinese or American help. It's our taxpayer-funded project, and we want to provide electricity. And we are seeing a huge sort of, this has been going on for decades. And we just a few days ago, Egypt wrote to the UN Security Council asking for a resolution. The international community has by and large failed to negotiate this. So we are living under really, really difficult times. Ethiopia is already embroiled in internal conflict, and now this is playing out even more as Ethiopia tries to fill the dam even more. So that's a very good case that requires further research. Who else was it? Oh, the first speaker. Yes, so very briefly, one of the things that I should have mentioned more, and it's a part of my argument in my articles, is that development is a contested notion. We don't agree here, I'm sure, if we asked each other, what is development? We will all have different ideas of development. Some of us want, things, we want electricity. Some of us want love. Some of us want children. We want, freedom of movement. We want to buy a car. Our idea of development differs. I was telling you about India and China, and these development has been for many years getting a car. In India, it was moving from a two-wheeler, a scooter, a motorcycle, to a four-wheeler. If everybody wants that kind of development, obviously we're going to struggle. The roads of Salt Lake City are still the same as they were 40 years ago, but the cars have multiplied. So I think development is a contested notion, and we have very different ideas in international politics of what development is. And my illustration of the oil in Uganda or natural gas in Mozambique and Senegal is illustrative of that. As you were saying, Margaret, in our parts of the world, development is about reducing our reliance on fossil fuels because we've achieved a certain level of development. In many other parts of the world, they're saying, why should we cut down what we have as natural resources just to please your global targets? Yes, we agree. We all love to do something about climate change, but we also have abject poverty. And that is where the global north and the global south, very general categories, differ in their policies, because the idea, the understanding of need, I would say in the global north, ignores extreme poverty in the global south. Because we're all in the same boat. We want a cleaner earth. And the rich countries want, emission levels to go down because it's in their benefit. But I think they need to pay greater attention to development as is being articulated in other parts of the world. And I don't think that is happening, which also means that we often have problems in legalizing, in doing anything about sustainable development, but not least to provide money. We don't provide enough money for sustainable development. We talk about it, but we're not putting in the money. And this is the final point. The war in Ukraine, I would say, and also the pandemic has made many, many countries look inwards. The UK is a very good example from mainstreaming global Britain to talking about aid. It drastically cut aid. Many, many other countries are using their own aid within their borders. They're becoming the largest recipients of their own aid. That is not the way to go about it.
Okay, thank you very much. I know there's an enthusiastic. So I'm going to. This will be the last set of questions we're taking, and then there will be conversations if you want to. Just to make sure that we don't go over. I mean, we should be stopping now, but I'm giving some additional time. There are two hands at the back. Can I see those hands again at the back? And one here. Okay. So 3 questions. If you could. You also wanted to ask a question. 4. Okay. Nobody should say 5. Okay. All right. Let's have 2 there and 2 here. Okay. Where's the row? Okay.
From my question is when you're speaking about China's successes, especially around Beijing, it made me think, is there a connection between globalization versus protectionism in regards to our success in terms of implementing the SDGs? So as we globalize, we push production into areas maybe we don't have as much oversight, and we can't hold those sort of companies or production facilities as accountable. But that also comes with certain advantages. What's your thoughts on that?
Very briefly, just so that I'm getting tired, so I may want to respond directly. It's a very good point, actually. I just want to point to the Rana Plaza fire in Bangladesh a few years ago. A huge garment factory burnt down, workers died because of poor working conditions. There were no exit routes. And all these major global chains like H&M and Zara, they all said now is the time to do something different about workers' rights, about environmental protection, preventing accidents, etc. All these years down the line, not much has changed. So yes, globalization does create the consumer. We as consumers have enormous power to say we're not going to buy products that are made by children, or to buy Nike shoes or footballs that are produced in Pakistan, or carpets, you name it. But we have to follow this up with our consumer might, which we often don't. Even in rich countries, it is cheap, affordable goods that still rule the day. If we are given a choice between something cheap and something more expensive, we end up choosing the cheap one, which also undermines some of these things that we could do more of. So the short story is that you're absolutely right. There's a lot of potential, but in reality, Rana Plaza is just that one example for me that shows why a lot of attention that was created dissipates as we go down the line. And yes, there is less oversight. So what we need is more attention in Bangladesh or Vietnam or all of these other places, including in China with Apple producing its phones there. If we as Apple produce say, we don't want to buy a phone that is made under these conditions, we'd rather pay more, that would be a persuasive case. So I think the buck stops with us consumers. We have that power. And whether we choose to exercise it, that's another thing altogether.
Thank you very much okay, Dr.
I think you want to come up here.
So yeah.
You're going to be put on the spot.
I don't know. Ready. So yeah, as we were asking in regard to the issue, like we check SDG number 3 as now, and the government start consider enrolling NHI. Is it a policy contested or policy developed if also NR reaches out with African Scientific Progress Award to fund the net taxi? I believe when you commit yourself with the SDGs, there are also some tax incentives that come out from the net fixing generation. So when we check SDG number 4, the South African perspective, is it under National Development Plan? Or the Bella Bill, when we consider to introduce AI as another collaborative tool for research in universities, does that also factor? Are they amended? Are they amendable? Or are they incrementable when we introduce AI to quality education, GEM number 4, AIQE? Is it IQ who's going to help us build those tools or so the other one is tax also, does it play a role if Future Africa Hub receive 400 million euros? Is it Africa, is it directed by Europe or is it directed as a global chain space? The other one was for, I think let me cut it short.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Thank you. You spoke of trade-offs and that we're not ready to make them. And I was listening to you on local municipalities, where sometimes you find people that are selling in the side stills. And if you remove those people, you have human rights organizations saying that's criminalization of poverty. Because now if you chase them away, how are they going to work or make a living? So I just wanted to ask you, how does politics shape those competing interests at a local level, especially at municipal level, whereas we need to enforce those laws? In your case, maybe no no noise pollution, but at the same time, it means something else. So how does politics shape those competing interests? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent question. And so, yes, if you, and this is a case we've seen in many parts of the African continent, but also in Asia, hawkers who are illegally occupying public spaces, disrupting traffic, selling their wares where they see the customers, bus stops, and they're creating chaos. And local municipalities in Zomba, Malawi, or in Calcutta, or in Lusaka, they've undertaken many of these drives. And one strategy is, again, going back to my point about having an alternative. You can't just throw people out without saying, where do you go? So you relocate them to a market. Now, then they complain, the market is far away from the bus stop, so we don't want to use the market, which is also valid. So I think to think through strategies where relocation does not lead to their loss of business, right? So those are things that one has to, and there is always that trade-off. So you want to beautify a city, but you may affect that livelihood. But my point is that you have to think through that alternative. And I think one of the things where local governments often can do better is to have that consultation. It's a bit of a give and take. One often ends up just deciding this is what has to be done because the first lady of the country has decided we want to beautify the country. Out with you. That's not how it works. You have to sort of engage people, to hear their needs and demands and then to find a strategy. So I think the municipalities have quite a lot of work to do. I have to also say, in terms of the SDGs, municipalities have actually been one of those success stories in some parts of the world where they've been able to enact there's been a localization of certain SDGs that hasn't been the case at the national level. So you can look it up, and there's lots of cases that the OECD, this grouping in Europe, they've highlighted through their reports the crucial role of municipalities in providing SDGs. To your question, sir, they were very complex, and I'm not an expert on South Africa. You mentioned several things. All I will say is that the crucial thing is how global goals are operationalized at the local level. Now, each government wants to say, we have certain national policies, and we need to see whether these voluntary global goals are in tune or in contradiction with national law. So that's why some countries are trying to, develop local indicators, local things. Many African governments are not so interested in the climate SDGs, those higher level goals, because they want to focus on infrastructure, economic growth, cities, urban planning, poverty, hunger, education, health. And so each country ends up choosing some of these SDGs from this basket, and they try to, localize them. But I just want to leave you with one thing that somebody told me in India several years ago. They said, you guys are talking about fifth floor issues, these global goals. We're still stuck in the first floor. So just to illustrate that, different countries, different contexts, they want to prioritize differently. The crucial thing is that there is political enthusiasm to do so. The trouble with the SDGs is it is wonderful. It's a bit of everything, right? And so governments often feel a bit frustrated. Tell us what to prioritize. You want us to do everything. We can't. We have limited resources. Tell us what to do first. Climate smart, gender sensitive, the list goes on, right? You're exhausted with all these reports that you have to file and then be held to account at the UN high-level political forum. No wonder you don't want too many critical questions.
Okay, thanks. Is there a question? Okay, so there's a question here. We take this one first and then we can go online and yeah. Yeah, close the session. I mean, you can hang around and and have some discussions with the speakers and people around. Okay.
I'm
quick
sorry,
question.
mine will be very quick. I just want to say thank you. But so these discussions are taking place at this level with universities and lecturers and researchers, but whose role is it to take it to the communities, to the people on ground level? When is that collaboration gonna kick in? So that's all. Thank you.
I think the short answer is all of us. I don't think we should, as researchers, say, oh, we just should talk to the high and mighty. We need to do evidence-based research. But you see, the trouble is that we don't want to take on added responsibilities. We're not comfortable. One of the reasons why we can't always communicate with politicians is we think, as long as we've done the research, the article is published, somebody else should read it and act upon it. That has been the classical academic way of thinking. I'm not saying that we all should become activists. I'm not comfortable being an activist, but I think we can communicate better and maybe to think about how to reach new audiences better. But certainly it's the communities that is providing us with the evidence. And if we don't do, field work and evidence, we shouldn't be stuck in the national capitals, thinking about SDGs without actually seeing how it is working out on the ground. So academics, NGOs, political parties, youth movements, we all are in this together. So, but we can't avoid not thinking about what communities are doing. That is the basis. That gives us credibility. When we say anything, at least I'd like to think so, it's because we've consulted and not just assumed that that is what they want. That would be patronizing.
Okay, thank you very much. So for the person online, we can take a quick question. No
I'll just
context.
read out
Yeah.
the question.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it's Lamek Kachena. He says, prior to SDGs, we had the MDGs, which were not fully achieved by many countries. Are there any political shortfalls we learned from the MDGs to improve the implementation of SDGs, especially for African countries?
And I'll be very quick. Yes. So most governments say MDGs, SDGs, they don't care. We just want to do something. It's just the same. The big problems haven't been resolved. One of the good things about the MDGs, there were 8 targets. Now we're talking about 17. So you see, the MDGs were for low-income countries. It was going to be financed by foreign aid, mainly. With the SDGs, it's all about us. We've widened the sphere, which also means that while rich countries are on board, the agenda is a bit more watered down. So I'll just leave it at that. You're desperate to leave, I know.
Okay. All right. No, thank you very much. I didn't realize that it's going to be such a lovely discussion. So when we decided on how much time we need to give to this seminar, we thought, just in case there aren't questions, I will prepare questions. So you have saved me from asking my own questions. But I'm really excited about the enthusiasm that that Dan has been able to generate in the room and the discussions, and lots of thinking. So thank you very much for coming and for engaging with the speaker, and thanks Dan for taking the questions. They were at different levels, and you try to respond to them. As I said, this is the beginning of us thinking together about SDGs, and that's why we have this this center of excellence between Europe and Africa, to try and push for not only scholarly work, but how we integrate this into practice, into policies. So that's what we're trying to do, and we really appreciate your questions, which have helped us to refine our thinking about what we actually need to do, what questions we need to tackle and expand on.